The letter arrived at dawn, and it changed everything before breakfast was even served. Evelyn Hart stood frozen in the narrow hallway of Ashcombe Hall, her fingers trembling around the folded paper the butler had just placed in her hand. Her name was written on the front in a bold, unfamiliar script. She had not asked for a letter. She had not expected one. And yet here it was, waiting to unravel the quiet, careful life she had built for herself over the past year. She opened it right there, unable to wait even the few steps to her room. The words on the page made her breath catch. A proposal. A real proposal from a real gentleman asking for her hand in marriage. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the walls could hear it. She had spent months believing herself invisible in this grand house, a shadow moving quietly between the nursery and the library, unseen by the one man whose gaze she secretly longed to catch. And now, in a single morning, another man had seen her, wanted her, and was asking her to become his wife. She pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. Somewhere upstairs, she could hear the Duke's voice, low and commanding, giving instructions to a servant about the day's business. He did not know yet. He did not know that in a matter of days she might no longer be his daughter's governess. She might no longer be anyone's shadow at all. Evelyn had come to Ashcombe Hall a year earlier, in the gray chill of early autumn, carrying a single trunk and a letter of recommendation from a family 2 counties away. She was 23 years old, with soft brown hair she kept pinned back without fuss, and eyes the color of strong tea, quick and watchful. She was not the kind of woman who turned heads in a crowded room. She preferred it that way. A woman who did not draw attention could move freely, speak honestly, and keep her heart safely tucked out of anyone's reach. The carriage that brought her to the estate rolled up a long gravel drive lined with ancient oak trees, their branches bare and reaching like fingers against the pale sky. Ashcombe Hall rose before her, enormous and gray, with dozens of windows catching the weak morning light. Evelyn had never seen a house so large. Her own family home could have fit inside its entrance hall. She was greeted not by the Duke, but by Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, a stout woman with kind eyes and a brisk manner that suggested she ran the household with far more authority than anyone gave her credit for. "You must be Miss Hart," Mrs. Whitmore said, looking her over once quickly, the way a woman sizes up a new piece of furniture to see if it will suit the room. "The Duke is occupied this morning. He is always occupied. You'll meet him eventually, I'm sure, though don't expect much conversation. He keeps to himself." Evelyn nodded, grateful in truth that she would not have to face the master of the house on her very first day. She had heard whispers about him during her journey, at the coaching inn where she had stopped to change horses. The Duke of Ravensworth, they said, had lost his wife 2 years before, and grief had turned him into a cold, distant man, more comfortable with ledgers and land agreements than with people. "And the child?" Evelyn asked. "Lily." At the mention of the little girl's name, Mrs. Whitmore's stern face softened at once. "Ah, poor lamb, barely speaks above a whisper these days. Lost her mother so young, and her father, God love him, doesn't know how to comfort a child. He loves her, mind you, loves her fiercely. He simply doesn't know how to show it. That will be your task, Miss Hart, if you're willing to take it on. Teach her more than her letters and numbers. Teach her to smile again." Evelyn felt something stir in her chest, a quiet resolve settling into place. She had lost her own mother young, and she remembered too well what it felt like to sit alone in a large, silent house, waiting for someone to notice the ache behind her eyes. If she could give this child even a fraction of the comfort she herself had once longed for, then the long journey to this cold northern estate would be worth every mile. She was led up a wide staircase, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch her every step, until she reached the nursery wing. There, in a chair by the window, sat a small girl of 6 years old, her golden curls falling loose around her shoulders, a wooden doll clutched tightly in her lap. She did not look up when the door opened. "Lily," Mrs. Whitmore said gently, "this is Miss Hart. She has come to be your new governess." The child's eyes lifted, pale blue and wary, studying Evelyn with the careful suspicion of someone who had been disappointed before. Governesses had come and gone in this house. It seemed, each one lasting only a few months before deciding the position was not worth the isolation, or the coldness of the master, or the sorrow that clung to the walls like a fog that never lifted. Evelyn crossed the room slowly and knelt down so that she was eye level with the little girl, rather than towering above her the way adults so often did. "Hello, Lily," she said softly. "I like your doll. Does she have a name?" For a long moment the child said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet Evelyn had to lean in to catch it, she answered, "Her name is Rose." "Rose is a lovely name," Evelyn said, smiling. "My mother's garden was full of roses when I was your age. Would you like to hear about it sometime?" A tiny nod. It was not much. It was barely anything at all. But Evelyn recognized it for what it was, the very first thread of trust offered by a child who had learned to guard her heart far too early in life. Evelyn made a silent promise to herself in that moment. She would not rush this girl. She would not press too hard or expect too much too soon. She would simply be present, steady, and patient for as long as it took. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm. Evelyn rose early, before the rest of the house stirred, and spent a quiet hour with a book of her own before the day's lessons began. She taught Lily her letters in the morning, sitting together at a small table by the nursery window, and in the afternoons, when the weather allowed, they walked the grounds together, naming the birds they saw and collecting fallen leaves to press between the pages of a notebook. Slowly, so slowly that Evelyn almost did not notice it happening, Lily began to change. The wary silence that had greeted her on that first day gave way, bit by bit, to soft laughter, to questions asked eagerly, to small hands reaching for hers without hesitation. By the second month, Lily had taken to following Evelyn from room to room, chattering about everything and nothing, as though she had finally found someone who would not disappear the way so many others had. The one figure who remained distant, however, was the Duke himself. Evelyn saw him only rarely, and always from a careful distance. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across a serious brow, and eyes so shadowed by grief that Evelyn sometimes found herself wondering what color they truly were, beneath all that sorrow. He moved through the house like a man carrying an invisible weight, his shoulders set, his expression unreadable, his attention always fixed on some distant point that no one else could see. He did not speak to Evelyn beyond the barest necessities. A nod in the hallway, a brief inquiry once every few weeks about his daughter's progress, delivered in a clipped, businesslike tone that made it clear he considered the conversation a duty rather than a pleasure. Evelyn told herself again and again that this suited her perfectly well. She had not come to Ashcombe Hall seeking the attention of a duke. She had come to do a job, to earn her wage, to give a grieving child a reason to smile again. Whatever the master of the house thought of her, if he thought of her at all, was entirely beside the point. And yet, there were moments, small and fleeting, that Evelyn could not quite explain away. Once, passing him in the corridor outside the library, she had looked up just as he glanced her way, and for the briefest instant something flickered across his face, something that was not quite indifference. He had looked away first, his jaw tightening, and continued on without a word. Evelyn had stood there afterward, her heart beating strangely fast, telling herself it had meant nothing at all. Another time, she had been playing the old pianoforte in the drawing room, believing herself entirely alone, filling the empty house with a soft melody she had learned as a girl. She had not heard the door open. It was only when she finished the piece and turned to gather her sheet music that she saw him standing in the doorway, silent, watching her with an expression she could not name. The moment he realized she had seen him, he straightened, cleared his throat, and offered some brief, awkward remark about the acoustics of the room before retreating down the hall as though the very air had grown too warm for him to bear. Evelyn had sat at that pianoforte for a long while afterward, her hands still resting on the keys, wondering what exactly had just happened and why her cheeks felt so warm. She scolded herself for such foolishness. She was a governess, he was a duke. The distance between their two worlds was as vast and immovable as the estate's ancient stone walls. Whatever small, curious flickers passed between them in stolen moments meant nothing, could mean nothing, and she would be a fool to let her heart wander down a path that could only end in disappointment. So she buried the thought, the way she had learned to bury so many things, and turned her attention back to the child who needed her far more than any brooding, grieving Duke ever could. It was Lily, in the end, who first noticed what Evelyn refused to admit even to herself. They were sitting together in the garden one bright afternoon in late autumn, arranging pressed leaves into a pattern on the stone bench between them, when Lily looked up with the sudden, unfiltered directness that only children possess. "Miss Hart," she said, "do you like my papa?" Evelyn nearly dropped the leaf in her hand. "What a question," she said, laughing softly to cover her surprise. "Of course I like your papa, he is a kind employer." Lily tilted her head, unconvinced. "You go very quiet when he walks by, and your face gets pink." "It is only the cold air," Evelyn said quickly, though the afternoon was mild and still. "Now, shall we find a few more leaves before the light fades?" Lily did not press the matter further, though Evelyn caught her giving a small, knowing smile as she bent back to her task, the kind of smile that suggested a child understood far more than the adults around her ever gave her credit for. That evening, alone in her small room beneath the eaves, Evelyn sat by her window and watched the last light fade over the distant hills. She thought of the Duke's face in the doorway of the drawing-room, the strange softness that had crossed his features before he caught himself and turned away. She thought of the brief, careful nod he gave her in the corridors, the way his eyes sometimes lingered a moment too long before he remembered himself. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself this every single night, as the months passed and autumn gave way to a long, cold winter, and the seasons turned again toward spring. She told herself this so many times that she almost believed it. But hope once planted is a stubborn thing. It does not wait for permission to grow. And somewhere beneath the careful, guarded surface Evelyn presented to the world, a quiet hope had indeed taken root, small and fragile, reaching toward a light she was almost too afraid to acknowledge. She did not yet know that a letter was coming, one that would force every buried feeling to the surface at once. She did not yet know that a gentleman from the neighboring county, kind and direct in a way the Duke had never learned to be, would soon walk into her carefully ordered life and ask the one question she had never let herself imagine answering. For now she only knew the quiet comfort of a child's small hand in hers, the fading warmth of an autumn afternoon, and the strange, persistent flutter in her chest whenever a certain tall, dark-haired man happened to pass by. It was not much. It was barely anything at all. But it was enough, for now, to keep her heart quietly, dangerously hoping. Winter arrived at Ashcombe Hall with a hush that settled over the grounds like a held breath. Snow gathered along the window ledges, and the fires in every hearth burned late into the night to keep the great stone house from growing too cold. Evelyn spent those months mostly indoors with Lily, teaching her to read longer sentences, to add and subtract small sums, to embroider simple patterns onto scraps of linen with a needle far too big for her small fingers. The Duke remained as distant as ever, though Evelyn noticed, in the quiet way she noticed most things, that his distance had begun to feel less like coldness and more like caution. There was a difference, she thought, between a man who did not care and a man who was afraid to. She could not have explained how she knew this, only that something in the careful way he avoided her eyes, the way he seemed to arrange his schedule so their paths rarely crossed, suggested a man guarding himself rather than a man simply indifferent to her presence. She did not dwell on it. She could not afford to. A governess who allowed herself to hope for more than her position offered was a governess setting herself up for heartbreak, and Evelyn had already known enough of that in her short life. She focused instead on Lily, on the slow, steady blossoming of a child who had once flinched at loud noises and now laughed freely, who had once refused to speak above a whisper and now chattered happily through every meal, telling anyone who would listen about the stories Miss Hart had read to her, the songs Miss Hart had taught her, the games they invented together on rainy afternoons when the grounds were too wet for walking. It was this very transformation, in fact, that finally forced the Duke to take notice. He came upon them one evening in early spring, the last of winter's chill still lingering in the air, as he passed the drawing room on his way to his study. He paused in the doorway, drawn by the sound of laughter, and found his daughter seated on the floor with Evelyn, both of them bent over a small collection of paper birds Evelyn had folded for a lesson on shapes and colors. Lily was laughing so hard she could barely speak, trying to explain to Evelyn why her paper bird looked more like a potato than a swan, and Evelyn was laughing right along with her, unguarded and warm in a way he had never once seen her look in his presence. He stood there longer than he intended, watching the two of them, something shifting uncomfortably in his chest. This was his daughter. This was his home. And yet the warmth filling this room felt entirely foreign to him, as though he were glimpsing a happiness that belonged to someone else's family, someone else's life. Evelyn looked up and saw him first. The laughter died on her lips, replaced by the careful, composed expression she always wore in his presence, the mask she had learned to wear so well that she sometimes forgot it was a mask at all. "Your Grace," she said, rising quickly, smoothing her skirts. "We did not hear you." "Papa," Lily scrambled to her feet, holding up her crumpled paper creation with pure, unguarded delight. "Look what Miss Hart taught me to make. It is supposed to be a swan." The Duke's gaze moved from the paper bird to his daughter's bright, hopeful face, and something in his own expression softened, just barely, just enough for Evelyn to notice. "It is a very fine swan," he said, and though his voice remained formal, there was a gentleness beneath it that Evelyn had not heard from him before. "Perhaps the finest swan I have ever seen." Lily beamed, utterly delighted, and launched into an excited explanation of how Miss Hart had shown her the folds, how you had to be very careful with the corners, or the wings would not sit right, how they were going to make an entire flock by the end of the week to hang above her bed. The Duke listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, his eyes drifting every so often toward Evelyn, who stood quietly to the side, watching the exchange with a small, careful smile. When Lily finally paused for breath, the Duke cleared his throat and addressed Evelyn directly for what felt, to her, like the first time in months. "She has changed a great deal, Miss Hart," he said, "since your arrival." "She is a bright child, Your Grace," Evelyn replied. "I have done very little. She simply needed someone to remind her it was safe to be happy again." Something flickered across his face at those words, a shadow of old grief passing briefly through his eyes before he mastered it. "Safe to be happy," he repeated quietly, as though testing the words for himself. "Yes. I suppose that is a thing a person can forget, given enough time." For a moment the two of them simply looked at each other, and Evelyn felt, quite suddenly, as though the careful distance between them had thinned to almost nothing, as though one more word, one more sentence might close it entirely. But then the Duke seemed to catch himself, his shoulders straightening, the familiar formal mask sliding back into place. "I am glad she is well cared for," he said, his voice returning to its usual clipped, businesslike tone. "Do not let me interrupt your lesson further." He turned and left the room without another word, and Evelyn stood there for a long moment afterward, her heart beating strangely fast, wondering why the loss of his brief warmth felt so much like disappointment. That night she could not sleep. She lay awake in her narrow bed beneath the eaves, staring up at the dark ceiling, replaying the moment in the drawing room again and again in her mind. Safe to be happy again. He had spoken those words as though they meant something particular to him, as though he, too, had spent a very long time believing happiness was no longer his to have. She thought of what Mrs. Whitmore had told her, that first day, about the young Duchess who had died 2 years before Evelyn's arrival, about the grief that had swallowed the Duke so completely that the staff had feared, for a time, he might never emerge from it. She thought of the portraits she had glimpsed in the East Wing, a beautiful, laughing woman with golden hair, painted before whatever illness had taken her from this world far too soon. She thought of how difficult it must be to love someone so completely and then lose them, to be left alone in a vast house with a small child who did not yet understand why her mother would not be coming back. Evelyn's own heart ached at the thought, and she was surprised, and a little frightened, by the depth of that ache. When had she begun to care so much for this man's sorrow? When had her quiet observations of him, her careful, guarded interest, deepened into something that felt suspiciously close to tenderness? She rose the next morning determined to set the feeling aside. She had a position to maintain, a child to educate, a life to lead that did not include foolish daydreams about a man so far above her station that the very idea of anything between them was, quite simply, impossible. Dukes did not marry governesses. Everyone knew this. It was one of the unspoken rules of the world she lived in, as fixed and unchangeable as the seasons themselves. But rules, Evelyn was beginning to learn, had very little power over a heart that had already, quietly and without permission, begun to hope. The weeks that followed brought small, unexpected changes to the rhythm of the household. The Duke began appearing at the family meals more often, where before he had frequently taken his supper alone in his study. He asked after Lily's lessons with genuine interest now, rather than the dutiful, distracted questions of before. And once, twice, 3 times, Evelyn caught him watching her across the table when he believed her attention was elsewhere, his expression thoughtful, unreadable, but no longer entirely cold. She told no one of these observations, not even herself, not in so many words. But she began to notice, with a small, guilty flutter of pleasure, that she took a little more care with her appearance on the mornings she knew she would encounter him in the hallway. She began to notice that she listened for his footsteps, that she recognized the particular rhythm of his stride long before he came into view. She began to notice, in short, all the small and foolish signs of a heart that had stopped listening to reason. It was Mrs. Whitmore who finally said aloud what Evelyn had been too afraid to acknowledge. They were folding linens together in the laundry room one gray afternoon, a task Evelyn often helped with, having never quite grown accustomed to being waited upon despite her position in the household, when the older woman set down the sheet she was holding and looked at Evelyn with a knowing, not unkind expression. "You've noticed it too, I expect," she said, "the change in him." Evelyn kept her eyes on her work, her cheeks warming. "I am not certain what you mean, Mrs. Whitmore." "Come now, Miss Hart, I have run this household for 15 years. I watched the old Duchess bring this man out of his shell once, and I have watched grief pull him right back into it these past 2 years. And now I am watching something else entirely happen, something I have not seen in a very long time." Mrs. Whitmore folded the sheet with brisk efficiency, her sharp eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. "You have brought his daughter back to life, Miss Hart, and unless I am very much mistaken, you have begun to do the same for him." "That cannot be," Evelyn said quickly, though her heart raced at the words. "I am the governess, nothing more." "For now," Mrs. Whitmore said simply, and there was something in her tone, something almost like a warning, that made Evelyn's breath catch. "But houses like this one have long memories, Miss Hart, and longer tongues. Be careful with your heart, child. A duke's attention is a dangerous thing for a woman in your position to receive, whether or not he ever acts on it. People will talk, and not everyone who sees you will see what I see." Evelyn did not know what to say to that, and Mrs. Whitmore, sensing the conversation had run its course, returned to her folding without another word, leaving Evelyn alone with her racing thoughts and the uncomfortable, undeniable knowledge that whatever she had been trying so hard not to feel, someone else had already seen it plainly written across her face. That night Evelyn stood at her window for a long while, watching the last candlelight flicker out in the windows across the courtyard, one by one, until only the Duke's study remained lit, a small square of gold against the darkness. She wondered what kept him awake so late. She wondered if he ever thought of her, even for a moment, the way she so often thought of him. She did not yet know that within a matter of weeks, a letter would arrive that would force the question out into the open at last, that a kind and direct gentleman from the next county would offer her a future she had never dared imagine, and that the Duke, faced with the very real possibility of losing her, would finally be forced to choose between his guarded heart and the quiet, patient love that had been growing, unnoticed, right beneath his own roof. For now she only knew the small, golden light in a distant window, and the stubborn, persistent hope that refused to let her heart rest easy. Spring came fully to Ashcombe Hall in a rush of green and gold. the grounds bursting into bloom almost overnight, as though the whole estate had been holding its breath through the long winter and could finally exhale. Evelyn and Lily spent nearly every afternoon outdoors now, wandering the gardens, naming the new flowers as they opened, chasing butterflies through the tall grass at the edge of the orchard. It was during one of these walks, in the first warm week of April, that Evelyn met Edmund Clark for the first time. They had wandered farther than usual, out past the estate's low stone wall to the small country church, where services were held each Sunday, drawn by Lily's sudden interest in the wildflowers growing along the churchyard path. Evelyn was kneeling beside the girl, helping her gather a small bouquet of daisies, when a pleasant, unfamiliar voice spoke from behind them. "Those are lovely specimens you found there, though I dare say the young lady has quite an eye for the best blooms." Evelyn turned to find a tall gentleman standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand, his expression open and friendly in a way that immediately put her at ease. He had warm brown eyes and an easy smile, and something about his manner suggested a man entirely comfortable in his own skin, without the guarded reserve she had grown so accustomed to at Ashcombe Hall. "Forgive me," he said, stepping closer. "I did not mean to startle you. Edmund Clark at your service. I have recently taken up residence at Thornfield Cottage, just beyond the church. I confess I am still finding my way around the neighborhood." "Evelyn Hart," she replied, rising and brushing the grass from her skirts. "I am governess to Lady Lily here at Ashcombe Hall." "Ah, the Duke's household. I have heard the family spoken of, though I have not yet had the pleasure of an introduction." Edmund's eyes moved briefly to Lily, who was watching him with open curiosity, and his smile widened. "And who is this fine young lady with such excellent taste in flowers?" "I am Lily," the girl announced, with the confident directness she had only recently learned to find. "These are for my papa's desk. He works too much and forgets to look outside." Edmund laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "A very wise observation. I dare say we could all stand to look outside a little more often." They spoke for a few minutes more, easy, pleasant conversation about the neighborhood, the church, the unusually fine weather for so early in the spring. Edmund proved to be a delightful conversationalist, quick with a gentle joke, attentive in a way that made Evelyn feel, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, that someone found her genuinely interesting to talk to, rather than merely a fixture of someone else's household. When at last they parted ways, Edmund bowed politely and expressed his hope that they might meet again, perhaps at the following Sunday's service. Evelyn walked back toward Ashcombe Hall with Lily skipping at her side, and found herself smiling, quite without meaning to, at the memory of the easy, unguarded conversation she had just shared. It should not have felt so remarkable, she told herself. It was only a brief exchange with a friendly neighbor, and yet the contrast struck her all the same, the difference between Edmund Clark's open warmth and the careful, guarded distance the Duke maintained even in his gentlest moments. Edmund had looked at her directly, had spoken to her as an equal, had shown genuine interest in what she had to say without a single flicker of the internal struggle she so often glimpsed behind the Duke's eyes. It should have been a relief, she thought. It should have felt like the simplest, most natural thing in the world, to be seen so plainly and so easily by a kind and pleasant man. Instead, walking back up the long gravel drive toward the great gray house rising against the spring sky, Evelyn found her thoughts drifting, against her own will, to the small square of golden candlelight she had watched flicker in a distant study window, and to the man behind it who had never once looked at her so easily, and yet whose careful, guarded glances she found herself missing before she had even left his presence. She did not yet understand what this meant. She only knew that something had shifted, quietly, that afternoon among the daisies, and that the careful, ordered life she had built for herself at Ashcombe Hall was about to become a great deal more complicated. She met Edmund again the following Sunday, as he had hoped, and then again the Sunday after that, their conversations growing longer and easier each time, until it became something of an understood arrangement that they would walk together after the service, weather permitting, with Lily trotting happily along beside them, delighted to have a new friend to show her favorite spots in the churchyard. Edmund was, by any reasonable measure, an excellent match for a woman in Evelyn's position. He came from a respectable family, had inherited a comfortable, if modest, fortune from an uncle, and had settled at Thornfield Cottage with the intention of taking up a quiet country life after several years spent managing business interests in London. He was kind, attentive, financially secure, and as far as Evelyn could tell, entirely without the shadows of grief and guarded reserve that seemed to follow the Duke through every room he entered. By any reasonable measure, Evelyn told herself again and again through the following weeks, she ought to have been delighted by his attention, and in many ways she was. It was pleasant, undeniably pleasant, to be sought out, to be spoken to so directly, to feel, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, that a man's interest in her was neither hidden nor uncertain. And yet, no matter how pleasant her afternoons with Edmund became, Evelyn found her thoughts returning, again and again, to a different man entirely, one who had never once spoken to her so plainly, who guarded every word and every glance as though his heart were a fortress he dared not lower the walls of, even for a moment. She did not understand it. She told herself, late at night, staring up at her dark ceiling, that it made no sense to prefer uncertainty and distance over kindness so freely given. And yet her heart, stubborn and unreasonable as hearts so often are, refused to be persuaded by logic alone. It was Mrs. Whitmore, once again, who noticed the growing attachment before anyone else in the household seemed to take note. "Mr. Clark seems a fine gentleman," she remarked one evening, as she and Evelyn sat together in the small sitting room the staff shared after supper. "Very attentive, from what I hear. Rose mentioned seeing you both after church again this Sunday past." "He is very kind," Evelyn said carefully, keeping her eyes on the mending in her lap. Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. "Kind is a fine quality in a husband, Miss Hart, fine indeed. And a woman in your position would be wise not to overlook a good and steady offer, should one come, simply because her heart has grown foolishly attached to a man whose station places him forever beyond her reach." Evelyn's needle stilled. "I have made no such attachment, Mrs. Whitmore." "Haven't you?" The older woman's voice was gentle, not unkind, but plain in its honesty. "I have eyes, child. I have watched you these past months, the way you listen for his step in the hall, the way your whole face changes when he enters a room, even now, even after all these weeks of Mr. Clark's pleasant company. I am not scolding you for it. The heart does not ask permission before it chooses where to settle, but I would be a poor friend to you if I did not speak plainly. A duke does not marry a governess, Miss Hart, however much either of them might wish otherwise. And a good man's honest offer of marriage is not a thing to be dismissed lightly while you wait for a miracle that may never come." Evelyn said nothing for a long moment, her throat tight with an emotion she could not quite name. She knew Mrs. Whitmore spoke the truth. She knew it in the careful, practical part of her mind that had guided every decision of her life thus far. And yet some other, quieter part of her, the part that still remembered a small square of golden candlelight, a paper swan that looked rather more like a potato, and two words spoken with unexpected gentleness, safe to be happy, refused to let the hope go entirely. She did not know, that evening, that Edmund Clark was already composing, in the privacy of his own study at Thornfield Cottage, the very letter that would soon arrive at Ashcombe Hall and force every carefully guarded feeling in that great gray house out into the open at last. She only knew that her heart, however foolish, however impractical, remained stubbornly, quietly divided, and that the coming weeks would demand of her a choice she was not yet ready to make. Spring deepened into early summer, and the days at Ashcombe Hall took on a strange, suspended quality, as though the entire household were waiting for something neither Evelyn nor the Duke could quite name aloud. Evelyn continued her Sunday walks with Edmund, whose attentions had grown steadily more particular, though he had not yet spoken the words that would make his intentions impossible to ignore. And she continued her quiet, careful existence within the walls of the great house, teaching Lily her lessons, catching the Duke's eye across the dinner table more often than either of them likely intended, and telling herself, night after night, that whatever she felt for him would simply have to remain unspoken forever. The Duke, for his part, seemed increasingly restless as the weeks passed, though Evelyn could not have said precisely why. She noticed him watching her more often now, not merely in fleeting glances but in longer, more considering looks that he seemed unable to fully mask, even when he caught himself and looked away. She noticed, too, a new tension in his manner whenever her walks with Mr. Clark were mentioned in passing conversation, a slight tightening around his eyes, a briefness in his replies that had not been there before. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself a great many things in those quiet weeks, most of which she did not fully believe. It was on a warm evening in early June, as the household gathered for supper beneath the soft glow of the dining room's candlelight, that Lily, with the fearless directness only a child possesses, finally said aloud what everyone else had been too careful to acknowledge. "Papa," she said, quite suddenly, between bites of her supper, "why do you always look sad when Mr. Clark walks with Miss Hart after church?" The table fell silent. Evelyn's fork froze halfway to her lips, her cheeks flooding with color. The Duke set down his own utensils with careful, deliberate slowness, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere on the tablecloth rather than meeting anyone's gaze. "I am not sad, Lily," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I simply have a great many matters on my mind." "You get that same face," Lily insisted, undeterred. "The one you got when Mama's portrait came back from being cleaned and you looked at it for a very long time. It's a sad face, Papa, I know it very well." Evelyn wished, quite desperately, that the floor might open beneath her chair and swallow her whole. She dared not look at the Duke, could not bear to see whatever expression now crossed his face, and instead fixed her eyes firmly on her plate, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire table could hear it. "That will do, Lily," the Duke said, his voice quieter now though no less firm. "Finish your supper." Lily, sensing she had perhaps ventured further than was wise, subsided into obedient silence, though she cast a curious, knowing glance between her father and her governess that suggested the matter was far from settled in her own young mind. The rest of the meal passed in strained, careful conversation, and Evelyn excused herself as soon as she reasonably could, retreating to her room with her heart in absolute turmoil. She had spent months convincing herself that whatever she felt for the Duke was hers alone to carry, a foolish, private hope that harmed no one so long as she kept it carefully hidden. But Lily's innocent words had shattered that comfortable fiction entirely. If a child of 6 could see it so plainly, how many others in this household had already noticed what Evelyn had worked so hard to conceal? She did not sleep well that night, and she was not alone in her wakefulness. Down the hall in his own private study, the Duke sat long past midnight, a glass of untouched brandy at his elbow, staring into the dying embers of his fire. Lily's words echoed in his mind, refusing to let him rest. "Why do you always look sad when Mr. Clark walks with Miss Hart after church?" He had told himself, for weeks now, that his growing preoccupation with Evelyn Hart's comings and goings was nothing more than an employer's natural concern for a valued member of his household. He had told himself a great many things, in fact, that he was no longer certain he believed. He thought of the sound of her laughter in the drawing room, unguarded and warm, a sound he found himself listening for throughout the long, quiet days. He thought of the careful, thoughtful way she spoke of his daughter's needs, always placing the child's well-being before her own comfort. He thought of the brief, charged moment in the doorway months before, when their eyes had met and something had passed between them that he had been too afraid then to examine too closely. And he thought, with a sharp, unwelcome twist of feeling he did not care to name, of Edmund Clark's easy smile, his open manner, the way the neighboring gentlemen had begun to call at the church with such regular, deliberate frequency that even the Duke, buried as he so often was in his own affairs, could no longer pretend not to notice the pattern. He was jealous. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, there in the quiet dark of his study, and he sat with it for a long while, turning it over in his mind with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to his estate ledgers, as though logic alone might make the feeling more bearable. He, Alexander Ashford, Duke of Ravensworth, a man who had believed himself entirely finished with matters of the heart after the loss of his wife, was jealous of a country gentleman's easy, uncomplicated attention toward his daughter's governess. It was, he told himself, entirely unacceptable, and entirely undeniably true. He did not know, that night, exactly what he intended to do about it. He knew only that something had shifted within him, quietly and irreversibly, and that the careful distance he had maintained for so long, the distance he had believed necessary and even kind, had become, quite suddenly, a burden he was no longer certain he wished to carry. He rose from his chair at last, well past the hour when any sensible man ought to have retired, and walked to the window, looking out over the dark, sleeping grounds of his estate. Somewhere beneath this same roof, in a small room beneath the eaves, Evelyn Hart lay awake as well, though he could not have known it, both of them caught in the same tangled web of feeling neither had yet found the courage to name aloud. Neither of them yet knew that within a matter of weeks, a letter from Thornfield Cottage would arrive to force the question into the open once and for all, that the careful, comfortable silence they had both maintained for so long was about to become impossible to sustain, and that the coming days would demand of them both a reckoning neither felt fully prepared to face. For now there was only the dark, quiet house and two hearts, separated by a single hallway and a lifetime of careful distance, each wondering in their own private sorrow whether the other might ever find the courage to close the gap between them. The letter from Thornfield Cottage arrived on a bright Tuesday morning, carried up from the village by the same young messenger boy who usually brought nothing more exciting than seed catalogues and correspondence for the Duke's estate manager. Evelyn was in the nursery with Lily when Mrs. Whitmore knocked softly and handed it to her, a knowing look in her eyes that told Evelyn, before she had even broken the seal, exactly what sort of letter this was likely to be. She excused herself to the small window seat at the end of the hallway, her hands not quite steady as she unfolded the pages. Edmund's handwriting was neat and confident, each line composed with the same easy warmth he brought to their Sunday conversations. He wrote of his admiration for her character, her patience, her gentle wit. He wrote of the comfortable life he could offer her at Thornfield Cottage, a home of her own at last, a household where she would never again need to answer to another family's schedule or another family's grief. And at the close of the letter, in careful, deliberate words, he asked for her hand in marriage, requesting only that she take whatever time she needed to consider her answer, and promising to call upon her the following Sunday to hear it. Evelyn sat with the letter in her lap for a long while after she finished reading, staring out at the sunlit gardens without truly seeing them. It was everything a sensible woman in her position ought to want: security, a home, a kind and steady husband who had never once made her feel invisible. She thought of Mrs. Whitmore's careful warning, weeks before, about foolish hearts and impossible attachments. She thought of the long, uncertain years that might stretch ahead of her if she remained at Ashcombe Hall, forever hoping for a man who might never find the courage to speak. And yet when she tried to imagine her future at Thornfield Cottage, arranging flowers on Edmund's mantelpiece, presiding over his table, growing old beside his easy, pleasant smile, she found she could not quite picture it clearly. The image kept slipping away from her, replaced, against her every effort, by a small square of golden candlelight in a distant study window, and a voice that had once said, quietly and with unexpected feeling, "Safe to be happy again." She told no one of the letter's contents at first, not even Mrs. Whitmore, though the housekeeper's knowing glances over the following days made it clear she suspected precisely what had arrived. Evelyn carried the weight of the decision alone, turning it over and over in her mind during the long hours of Lily's lessons, during her quiet evenings with her needlework, during the sleepless nights when sensible reasoning and stubborn hope waged their quiet, exhausting war within her. She might have kept her own counsel entirely, had it not been for Lily. The child had grown remarkably perceptive over the months of Evelyn's care, and it did not take her long to notice that her governess had grown unusually quiet, unusually distracted, her smiles a little slower to arrive than they had once been. On the third evening after the letter's arrival, as Evelyn tucked her into bed, Lily reached up and caught her governess's sleeve before she could straighten away. "Are you going to marry Mr. Clark?" she asked, with the same fearless directness that had unsettled the entire dinner table weeks before. Evelyn's breath caught. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Because Rose said the postman brought you a very important letter, and important letters from gentlemen usually mean proposals. I read that in one of the stories you gave me." Lily's small face was serious, searching. "If you marry him, will you go away and live somewhere else?" Evelyn sat carefully on the edge of the bed, taking the child's small hand in hers. "I do not yet know what I will decide, my darling. But whatever happens, I promise you that I care for you very much, and that will not change, no matter where I live." Lily's lower lip trembled, the old wariness Evelyn had worked so hard to soften over the past year threatening to resurface. "I do not want you to go, and I do not think Papa wants you to go either, though he would never say so." The words settled into Evelyn's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every careful, guarded certainty she had built for herself. She smoothed the child's hair back from her forehead, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "Go to sleep now, little one. We shall see what the future brings." She did not sleep that night either, and by the time the household stirred the following morning, she had resolved to write to Edmund and request a brief postponement of her answer. A small mercy of time in which to settle her own uncertain heart before committing it, and her entire future, to a decision she was not yet prepared to make. But the household, it seemed, had other plans entirely, for word of the proposal had already begun to travel, as such things inevitably did in a house full of watchful eyes and willing tongues, and it was not long before it reached the one person Evelyn had least expected and most feared to hear it. The Duke learned of Edmund Clark's proposal from his own valet, of all people, a man given to gossip despite his otherwise excellent service, who mentioned it in passing while laying out his master's coat for the morning, believing the news to be common knowledge among the staff by then, and therefore no great secret to share. "A fine match for Miss Hart, they say, sir," the valet remarked cheerfully, entirely unaware of the effect his words were about to have. "Mr. Clark of Thornfield Cottage has asked for her hand. The whole staff is wondering whether she'll accept him." The Duke went very still, his hand frozen on the button of his waistcoat. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the valet, sensing something amiss though not quite understanding what, fell into an uncomfortable silence of his own. "Thank you," the Duke said at last, his voice carefully controlled. "That will be all." He did not go down to breakfast that morning. He remained instead in his study, staring at a ledger he had no intention of reading, his mind consumed entirely by the news he had just received. She might say yes. The thought struck him with a force that left him almost breathless, a panic so sudden and so complete that he scarcely recognized himself in its grip. She might at this very moment be composing her acceptance, might already be planning her departure from this house, from his daughter's life, from his own life, which he realized now, with a clarity that came far too late, had grown quietly and completely dependent on her presence without his ever having fully admitted it to himself. He thought of the past year in a rush of scattered memories, her laughter in the drawing room, her patient, careful voice reading stories to his daughter, the paper swan that looked rather more like a potato, the moment in the corridor when their eyes had met and he had looked away first, too afraid of what he might reveal if he allowed the moment to continue even a second longer. He thought of every careful, guarded distance he had maintained between them, every conversation he had cut short, every warm feeling he had smothered beneath layers of duty and grief, and the stubborn, misguided belief that a man in his position had no right to want happiness again, let alone happiness with a woman so far beneath his station that the very idea would scandalize every drawing room in the county. He had told himself for months that this distance was wisdom. He understood now, sitting alone in his study with his untouched ledger and his racing heart, that it had been nothing more than cowardice, dressed up in the respectable clothing of propriety. He rose from his desk with sudden, decisive purpose, though he had not yet fully formed a plan for what he intended to say or do. He knew only that he could not sit idle a moment longer while the woman who had, without his ever quite realizing it, become essential to his happiness, prepared to give her hand to another man entirely. He found Evelyn in the garden that afternoon, sitting alone on the stone bench where she and Lily so often gathered their pressed leaves and wildflowers. Lily herself occupied indoors with a music lesson that would keep her occupied for the better part of an hour. Evelyn looked up at the sound of his approach, surprise evident on her face, for the Duke rarely sought her out directly, and certainly never without some clear purpose of business to justify the meeting. "Your Grace," she said, rising quickly, "is something the matter, is Lily?" "Lily is quite well," he said, and then, finding himself suddenly and uncharacteristically at a loss for words, he simply stood there for a long moment, studying her face as though searching for something he had somehow overlooked in all their months of careful distance. "Your Grace," Evelyn asked again, uncertain now, her hands twisting slightly in her skirts. "I understand," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended, "that you have received an offer of marriage." "From Mr. Clark." Evelyn's cheeks flooded with color and she looked away, toward the distant hedgerow, unable to meet his eyes. Word travels quickly in this house, it seems. "Have you given him your answer?" he asked, and though he tried to keep his tone even, something in his voice betrayed the tension coiled beneath the question. "Not yet," she admitted quietly. "I asked for time to consider." The Duke let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, relief washing through him with such force that it left him momentarily unsteady. Not yet. There was still time. Whether there was time enough for what he intended to say, he did not yet know, but the small, fragile hope of it was enough to carry him forward. "Miss Hart," he began, and then stopped, searching for words that had never come easily to him, words he had spent 2 long years believing he would never need again. "I have not been, I think, entirely honest with you, nor, I confess, with myself." Evelyn's eyes lifted to his at last, wide and uncertain, and something in her expression, a fragile, careful hope she could not quite hide, gave him the courage to continue. "When my wife died," he said slowly, "I believed a part of myself had died along with her. I closed myself off, from my daughter, from my household, from any possibility of feeling again what I had once felt for her. I told myself it was grief. I told myself it was respect for her memory. But I have come to understand, these past months, watching you with Lily, watching you bring warmth back into rooms I had believed permanently cold, that what I called grief had, for some time now, become something closer to fear. Fear of feeling anything at all, because feeling meant risking loss all over again." He paused, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have watched you for a year, Miss Hart, and told myself it was merely an employer's natural regard for a valued member of his household. I told myself this even as I found myself listening for your laughter through the walls, even as I found myself arranging my days around the small hope of passing you in a hallway. I told myself this even as the thought of another man asking for your hand struck me, this very morning, with a force I can only describe as unbearable." Evelyn's breath had gone entirely still, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Your Grace, I—" "Please," he said gently, "let me finish, before my courage fails me entirely, as it has failed me so many times before where you are concerned." He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers with an intensity she had never before seen from him. "I have overlooked you for months, Miss Hart, not because I did not see you, but because I saw you too clearly, and did not know what to do with the feeling that grew every time our eyes met. I was a coward. I let propriety and grief and fear keep me silent when I ought to have spoken long ago. And now I find myself standing before you, quite without dignity, asking you not to give your answer to Mr. Clark until you have heard mine." Evelyn's eyes had filled with tears she could no longer hold back, and she pressed a trembling hand to her lips, hardly able to believe the words she was hearing. "And what is your answer, Your Grace?" "That I cannot bear to lose you," he said simply, his own voice unsteady now. "Not as Lily's governess, and not, if you will permit me the presumption of hoping for more, as anything less than my wife. The garden seemed to hold its breath around them, the afternoon sun slanting warm and gold through the branches overhead, the distant sound of birdsong the only witness to a moment neither of them would ever forget for as long as they lived. Evelyn stood very still, her heart so full she could scarcely draw breath, searching his face for any sign that she had misheard him, that this was some cruel trick of her own foolish hoping rather than the truth standing plainly before her. "You are a duke," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper, giving voice to the very fear that had haunted her for months. "And I am a governess. The world will not easily accept such a match, your grace. There will be talk. There will be those in society who look upon me as nothing more than a fortune-seeker, however untrue that may be." "Let them talk," he said, and there was a new firmness in his voice now, a resolve that had been entirely absent from the careful, guarded man she had known for the past year. "I have spent 2 years hiding behind the opinions of a society that offered me no comfort in my grief, and would offer me none in my happiness either. I am done living my life according to rules that bring me nothing but loneliness. I would rather face every wagging tongue in the county than spend one more day pretending I do not love you." The word hung in the warm garden air between them, love, spoken plainly and without hesitation for the first time, and Evelyn felt something within her, some last fragile wall she had built to protect her heart, finally crumble away entirely. "I have loved you for months, I think," she confessed, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now, tears of relief and disbelief, and a happiness so complete it frightened her. "Since long before I would allow myself to admit it, even in the privacy of my own thoughts. I told myself it was foolish. I told myself it could never come to anything. And when Mr. Clark's letter arrived, I found I could not picture a future with him, however kind and steady he might be, because my heart had already, quite hopelessly, given itself to someone else." The Duke closed the remaining distance between them, and, with a gentleness that spoke of every careful, guarded feeling he had finally allowed himself to release, took her hand in his. "Then let me ask you properly, Miss Hart, as I ought to have found the courage to ask months ago. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" Evelyn looked up into his eyes, no longer shadowed by the distant grief she had grown so accustomed to seeing there, but bright now with a hope and warmth that matched her own entirely. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, with all my heart." He drew her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch all over again, and for a long, quiet moment, they simply stood together in the golden afternoon light, two hearts that had spent far too long guarding themselves against a happiness they had both, all along, secretly longed for. It was not, of course, quite so simple a matter as declaring their feelings and considering the question settled. There remained the delicate business of Mr. Edmund Clark, who deserved, Evelyn insisted, an honest and kindly delivered answer rather than mere silence or evasion. She wrote to him that very evening, choosing her words with the greatest care, thanking him sincerely for the honor of his proposal, and for the genuine kindness he had shown her throughout their acquaintance, while explaining, as gently as she could, that her heart had already been given elsewhere before his letter ever arrived, and that she could not, in good conscience, accept an offer she knew she would be unable to fulfill with the whole-hearted devotion he deserved. Edmund's reply, when it came, was gracious in a manner that only confirmed what a genuinely good man he was. He wrote that he was disappointed, naturally, but that he held no ill will toward her, and that he wished her every happiness in whatever future she chose to pursue. He added, with the same gentle humor that had first drawn Evelyn to enjoy his company, that he supposed a duke's household could offer certain advantages a country gentleman's cottage simply could not compete with, and he hoped she would not think too poorly of him for having tried his luck regardless. Evelyn read his letter with a warm, grateful heart, relieved beyond measure that she had not caused lasting hurt to a man who had, in his own way, treated her with nothing but genuine respect and kindness. There remained, too, the matter of the wider household and the wider world beyond it, both of which required careful and thoughtful handling. The Duke insisted on speaking with his staff himself, gathering them together in the great hall to announce his intentions plainly and without apology, making it clear that any member of his household who could not offer Evelyn the respect due to their future duchess was welcome to seek employment elsewhere. He needn't have worried on that account. The staff, led by an openly delighted Mrs. Whitmore, received the news with genuine warmth, for they had watched Evelyn's quiet, patient care transform both the household and its master over the past year, and there was not a single person among them who did not believe she had earned her happiness many times over. The wider society of the county proved a more complicated matter, as Evelyn had feared it might. There were indeed whispers and pointed looks at the few social gatherings she attended in the weeks following the announcement of their engagement. Ladies of certain established families who made their disapproval known through carefully chosen silences and cool, appraising glances. But the Duke, true to his word, met every such slight with a calm, unwavering firmness that left no room for doubt as to where his loyalties lay. And gradually, as the weeks passed, and it became clear that the match was no passing fancy but a genuine and deeply rooted devotion, even the most reluctant tongues began to soften, won over in no small part by the simple, undeniable fact of Lily's transformed happiness, which spoke more eloquently to the rightness of the match than any words the Duke or Evelyn might have offered in their own defense. Lily herself received the news with an unrestrained joy that brought tears to Evelyn's eyes all over again. She had thrown her small arms around Evelyn's waist the moment she was told, declaring, with all the fierce certainty of a child who had finally found the family she had been missing, that she had known it would happen all along, and that she had been hoping for it since the very first week of Evelyn's arrival, when she had noticed her papa's face change whenever Miss Hart entered a room. "I told you that you had a sad face, Papa," she reminded him solemnly, on the evening the engagement was formally announced to her, "and now you have a happy one instead. I think Miss Hart did that. I think she is very good at fixing sad faces." The Duke had laughed then, a full, unguarded laugh that Evelyn realized with a rush of tenderness. She had never once heard from him before that moment, and he had gathered his daughter into his arms and told her that she was entirely right, that Miss Hart, soon to be her new mother, had indeed fixed a great many sad faces in this house, his own included, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making certain hers remained just as happy in return. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early autumn, almost exactly a year to the day since Evelyn had first arrived at Ashcombe Hall with nothing more than a single trunk and a letter of recommendation, uncertain of what awaited her in the great gray house at the end of the long gravel drive. The small country church where she had first met Edmund Clark among the wildflowers was filled to capacity, the household staff seated proudly alongside the county families who had, by then, come to accept and even admire the match they had once viewed with such suspicion. Evelyn walked down the aisle in a gown of soft ivory silk, her heart full to overflowing, and found the Duke waiting for her at the altar with an expression of open, unguarded joy that erased entirely the last shadows of the grief that had once defined him. Lily stood nearby as her flower girl, scattering petals with the same fierce concentration she brought to every task Evelyn had taught her, beaming with a happiness that seemed almost too large for her small frame to contain. As they exchanged their vows, Evelyn thought back over the long, quiet months of her arrival, the careful distance she had maintained, the hope she had tried so hard to bury, the letter that had nearly sent her into another man's life entirely before her own heart, and the Duke's newly found courage, had intervened. She thought of Mrs. Whitmore's gentle warnings, of Lily's fearless honesty, of Edmund Clark's gracious kindness, of every small moment along the way that had shaped the winding, uncertain path leading her to this church, this morning, this man standing before her with tears of happiness openly shining in his eyes. She had come to Ashcombe Hall believing herself destined to remain invisible, a quiet shadow moving through a house too grand and too grief-stricken for her to ever truly belong. She left that church, hours later, as its duchess, having discovered that the very qualities she had once believed made her easy to overlook, her patience, her gentleness, her quiet steadiness of heart, were precisely the qualities that had in the end made her impossible for one particular man to overlook any longer. The months that followed their marriage brought a warmth to Ashcombe Hall that the old stone house had not known in many years. Evelyn settled into her new role with the same careful, thoughtful grace she had brought to every task before it, winning over the remaining doubters among the county families through simple, patient kindness rather than any grand display. She continued, for a time, to oversee Lily's education herself, unwilling to relinquish the close bond they had built together, until a new governess was eventually engaged to assist, though Lily made it plain to everyone who would listen that no one could ever truly replace her beloved Miss Hart, who was, after all, now simply Mama, and far too important to the family to be thought of as merely a governess ever again. The Duke, for his part, found himself a changed man in ways both large and small. He laughed more freely now, spent his evenings in the drawing-room rather than buried alone in his study, and took to joining Evelyn and Lily on their afternoon walks through the gardens whenever his duties allowed, delighting in small discoveries of wildflowers and birds' nests with an enthusiasm that surprised even himself. The portrait of his first wife remained in its place in the East Wing gallery, honored and remembered with genuine affection rather than the paralyzing grief that had once gripped him. For Evelyn had helped him understand, gently and without ever asking him to forget, that loving again did not mean loving less the memory of what had come before. Word of the Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth's devoted marriage spread gradually through the county and beyond, an unlikely love story that had begun in quiet, overlooked corners and blossomed, against every expectation, into one of the most genuinely happy unions the region had seen in a generation. Young women in humbler positions than Evelyn's own found in her story a quiet, hopeful reminder that true worth was rarely loud or obvious, that patience and kindness, however invisible they might seem in the moment, had a way of being seen at last by the right eyes at the right time. As for Evelyn herself, she often thought back, in quiet moments, to that first cold morning of her arrival at Ashcombe Hall, to the wary, silent child she had found in the nursery, to the distant, grief-shadowed man she had believed would never notice her at all. She thought of the letter that had nearly changed the entire course of her life, and of the courage it had ultimately taken, from both herself and the Duke, to set aside fear and propriety in favor of a happiness neither of them had quite believed themselves entitled to hope for. She had been overlooked for months, it was true, but she had never once in all that quiet waiting stopped being exactly who she was, patient, warm, steady, and true. And in the end, it was precisely that quiet steadiness, unhurried and unafraid to wait for what mattered most, that had finally, unmistakably been seen.